Hi everyone, I'm Simon, from YouTube, to Group Education specifically. We're an alternate history / real history channel with a focus on the West. They're shorter videos and quite simplified. So if you want a quick look at some random event, then here you go. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this timeline has two different divergence points. The first change is Spain's discovery of the Philippines. In this timeline, Spain sees the strategic advantage of the East Indies in trade with China, so invests more into the development of the islands. The second divergence is the 7 Years' War. Since Spain turned the Philippines into a trade hub with Asia, Britain invades it as part of the war, and it is added to the British Empire after the war is concluded. So now we have both a more advanced Philippines and a British Philippines. The Philippines would be administrated by the British East India Company, and the company would only really care about trade, meaning the majority of the islands are left mostly alone for the exception of forts and ports. The islands would mainly run off of plantations, which would be loosely administrated by the company but owned by locals, usually the Spaniards who stayed after the 7 Years' War. Britain wouldn't be all that invested in the Philippines since they preferred the exports of the Americas, until some commoners signed a certain document that caused Britain to be very upset. A war happens and Britain is kicked out of the Americas. The East Indies becomes their new focus, which means that the Philippines become their new focus, now with opium. Since the Philippines is so close to China, it becomes a major point for the opium trade. Since the opium trade is doing really well, the Philippines get a lot of profit and the economy booms. United Kingdom, it is I, China. We no longer want your opium. We have thrown it all away and will no longer buy it from you. Please, respect our decision.
No.
The Opium War began, and suddenly the Philippines became a staging point for fighting as troops would go to the Philippines first before invading China. Since the Philippines is so close, the British invasion is much more devastating. So devastating that there definitely won't be a second one. And there isn't. Britain takes control of the various ports and uses them for more trade, and China becomes reliant on Britain. Obviously, the Chinese don't like their country being controlled by a European country, so demand the British to get out. And they don't. So when a rebellion breaks out in southern China, it has a lot of support from the Chinese. What was this rebellion? It was called the Taiping Rebellion, and was headed by the Heavenly Kingdom. The other European powers, seeing that China's government is controlled by Britain, join in with the rebellion in hopes of solidifying their own zones of influence. Britain, wanting to keep control of its ports, supports China against the rebellion. So Britain brings in the East India Company, who then drafts Indians, Filipinos, and Chinese to fight for the British. The Chinese soldiers don't like fighting other Chinese, especially when working for a European, so they start mutinying. The Indians had an agreement with the East India Company that they wouldn't be sent overseas. But they were, and they weren't happy about that. This, mixed with a bunch of other factors, caused the Sepoy Rebellion in India. So now the British had two rebellions to fight. With everyone rebelling against the British, the Filipinos might as well join in. The British turned the Philippines into a massive military staging point to fight both rebellions, removing the island's autonomies in order to station soldiers and force war production. The Filipinos weren't happy about this, so did some minor revolts in the center island, which caused the Filipino soldiers abroad to stop fighting and protest, who were arrested or executed, which caused the revolts to increase, which caused more soldier protests. Eventually, this culminated in another rebellion. Since the British had to fight 3 rebellions, lost most of their foreign forces to mutinies, and was also going against the European community, Britain gave up and signed 3 different treaties ending the rebellions. In India, the northern princely states would become independent and Britain would annex the south. In the Philippines, the British would keep north of Luzon and the rest became a new independent Philippines. And in China, the Heavenly Kingdom took control of China and Britain took Taiwan, Hainan, Macau, Guangzhou, and keeps Hong Kong. Britain abolishes the East India Company and takes direct control of the British East Indies. With South India, Burma, Malay, North Borneo, and the Pacific Triangle, plus all the smaller territories, being united into a British defensive bloc against the rest of Asia. Eventually, Queen Victoria would be proclaimed Empress of the East Indies, meaning the bloc turns into the East Indies Empire. The new Heavenly Kingdom was not fit to rule China, since their government was an absolute theocratic monarchy with Christianity as their theocracy. The Chinese don't really like that, and massive unrest takes root, especially in the north and the west. So much so that the European powers are able to break off new puppets in China, from where their zones of influence are. Yunnan, backed by the French, East Turkestan and Mongolia, backed by Russia, and Manchuria, backed by Japan and the US, all eventually become independent one way or another. And what's left of the Heavenly Kingdom has to deal with new rebellions of those who want to return to the glory days of the dynasties. Since Britain cut off the US from the Philippines, the US goes directly to Japan, not only forcing them into trade, but taking over their strategic ports and forcing them into an alliance. Then, using Japan as a staging point, frees Manchuria as their attempt to take a part of China like all the other powers were doing. With the British kicked out, they then start backing the anti-Heavenly rebels to try to secure the Chinese trade. The Philippines still had all of the development left by the British. It was a strong nation and determined to unite the islands. It entered trade with the United States, and the US, the Philippines, Japan, Manchuria, and the Chinese rebels would join together into the Honolulu Pact, determined to control the Pacific. Like how the American Revolution made Britain run away to the East Indies, the Sepoy Rebellions made the British run away back to Africa. Bitter about losing so much influence and power, the British strike at Africa hard, suppressing the Boers and antagonizing other European powers over Africa. One incident in particular, in a little place called Fashoda, was a crisis that put Britain and France against each other. If Britain was determined to keep its place as a great empire, it would use it as an opportunity to solidify its role in Africa, attacking the French and starting World War I in 1898, with Britain against France. Well, wouldn't that be fun? But unfortunately, that's where my story ends. This new Great War will have to be a story for another video.